Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Deep Water from Hulu. So, we of course have Ben Affleck, who's played Vic in this movie, who a lot of people know probably Ben Affleck from the Affair movie called Gone Girl. And we of course have Ana de Armas, who is to, of course, play Melinda in here. And some people probably know her from the Affair movie Knock Knock with Keanu Reeves. And immediately once I'm putting these two in the same screen together, I'm like, this looks like a really good cast. I'm like, I want to see how this movie unfolds. Even though I'm immediately thinking that, I don't know if there's going to be a good enough story here. So, after I start watching this film, I'm like thinking in my head, I'm like, because the theme of this movie is an affair. And so I'm thinking, I'm like, okay, so we have to kind of compare this to Unfaithful, which weirdly, the people that did Deep Water had also done Unfaithful. I'm like, okay, I've seen Unfaithful. And I'm thinking of Gone Girl. I'm thinking of An Affair to Die For. And so I'm like coming up with all the affair movies in my head, just kind of going on, I'm like, is this movie going to add up to any of those? And after watching this film, I would say that there's some sliver of good in this movie in a large amount of boring for this film. Really, for this to be a rated R film, you would think that they would try to go into more things, but if anything, they try to pull away a lot more to where you're just kind of left with these scenes of it seeming like they're going at things, but it's just like, man, I could watch a way I could watch a way more interesting bedroom business scene in any other affair movie besides this one. Um, and like, I just feel like weird kind of saying that, but it's just like this movie is to kind of pull back, and I'm just like, for an affair movie? Okay. There's some sliver of good, and there is some interesting story, but I can't help but think, I'm like, man, if you could really just kind of cut through all of the boring in this film and get to the real interesting parts, I don't think that this really should be a 2 hour film. It just, really, once we actually get to the writer part of the story, I'm like, okay, this picks up a little bit, but this is too flat of a film. It's too much of just of kind of pick and choose what you can in this film and don't like. But a lot of people who are, of course, are also Euphoria fans. We of course have Jacob, who is to also be in this film as kind of the piano guy. So for Euphoria people will probably come in and see this movie for whatever reason. But I would recommend going on and watching any other affair film, like Unfaithful, Gone Girl, Affair to Die For, any other kind of thing. It's just there's just not enough here. But teeing it up, what is this about? So, beyond me just saying affair, and that's all you need to know, we go into this movie and we have Vic, who's to be this retired guy who is to make a living off of computer chips that are put into these drones. He is to also go on and publish some apps and to go on and do like certain kind of other uh, like photography and small jobs here and there, just because like Vic isn't really hurting for money. And so Vic, of course, is going on and seeing Melinda. Not only like she's basically flaunting these affairs right in front of Vic's face, bringing Melinda's an affair basically to parties, to their own home, anywhere, and then also Melinda is to basically just tell Vic, it's like, you know what, if you didn't have me, your life would be boring. And I'm just like, oh my god, like, so not only is this woman just like, Vic is like this doormat where she's just going on and just kind of cleaning her shoes and not even going back to kind of see, it's like, oh, like, did I leave anything there? No. Like, did I leave any mud on the floor anywhere? No, I don't care. If I track anything, I track anything in. I'm like, okay. So all of a sudden we go into this story, and when Vic is to meet the very first guy, we have Vic trying to scare this guy off, but he does it in a very strange like way, which all of a sudden has the whole entire town questioning, is what Vic is to say to this guy, is it true? And everybody's kind of second guessing, and everybody's going on and questioning Vic himself. And then we start to turn around and we find out whether or not Vic is to possibly go on and be a much more darker person than we are to realize within this film. So, yeah. So, with that said, I think that's all I want to say about this film in a very cryptic like sense. I would have to grade this movie to be interesting, but like that feels like a kind of, it's a light interesting, just because really I was just like, man, like I'm not clearly awake enough for this movie, but like I'm just clearly not like interested enough in this film to like, because immediately I'm thinking about the rewatching of this film, and I would say I would never go on and rewatch this film. There's just so many other good, or I wouldn't say good, but there's so many other like different kinds of things out there that are just like this, and so immediately this is going to be a quick forgettable thing, just because a, too, there's too many affair like films, and if you're not going to bring something heavily new to the table, if you're not going to bring something that you're just like, wow, like this movie blew me away, then don't waste the time to even put a movie like this out. That sounds harsh. It's true. Like, how many bajillion affair movies have there been? You can count them on 20 different hands. And just like an affair concept, there's a reason why people like don't do it as often, because they know that they have like a really high bar to try to reach, and this movie doesn't even like realize that there's a bar. It's just, hey, let's put another thing of content out there. That's really what this movie is. So, with that said, let's just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I spoil this movie. Let's go into it. So, the very beginning of this movie, we are to have Vic making his way home from this bike ride. And so Melinda is kind of looking at Vic, and she goes on to walk into another part of the house. So later on, we have both Vic and Melinda who are to go to this party with one of their friends. We, of course, have one of the girls there that's mentioning about her cleavage. And I'm like, oh, okay, all right. Like, so we're getting to this kind of movie where some people are kind of like really open about themselves. So, but yeah, so Melinda is to show up at this party with a guy named Joel. Hey, nice name. I wonder why I'm saying nice name here. And so we, of course, have this woman who's Mary who's asking Vic about, like, hey, like, it seems like your wife is, like, really just throwing around the fact that she is with this guy. And Vic is like, well, what do you want me to do? Like, I'm sorry if, like, she's just kind of being too, like, out and about this. Like, so we have, of course, Melinda, that is to be standing on top of this piano. She gets off the piano and starts playing this song. And the guys are having to go into the room that she's in because she's standing on top of this piano. But then she gets off of it and she starts playing this song. So we go on, and later on in the film, when Vic and Joel are to have their alone time, we have Vic, who is to tell Joel, within, I think, the same party, we have Vic telling Joel, it's like, well, there was a friend of Melinda's once that was to be called Martin McKay. And this guy now has gone missing. And Joel is just like, well, does that mean that you might have something to do with that? And Vic is like, yeah, because I killed him. It's like, so what? And Joel is like, I don't know if you're joking or not about that. And Vic is like, nah. So Joel's like, you know what, I'm just gonna leave. I'm just gonna go. And so all of a sudden, Vic claiming this is to all of a sudden have this spread through the town like wildfire. Everybody's to know that Vic is to have possibly killed this Martin guy. And then all of a sudden, the body is to bizarrely just show up. And so Vic is telling Melinda, like, well, like, I'm sorry, Melinda. They had gone on and they had finally found Martin's body. He's dead. So, all of a sudden, we have, of course, where everybody and the brother is starting to ask Vic, it's like, well, hey, like, it's kind of in bad taste for you to go on and to have, like, said that to a number of people. Like, we can't really believe that Vic is to be the murderer of this guy. So we have guys like Jonas, who of course is Dash Mahawk, who of course some people might know him from the movie Basic, or possibly from Punisher Warzone, if anybody's to see that. Check IMDb, it's great. Anyways, Jonas is to, like, go on and be like, hey man, like, you shouldn't be, like, telling people that. And we also have certain friends of Vic, like Grant, who is the guy with the glasses. And Grant is going on telling Vic, it's like, well, yeah, like, with your wife's affairs, like, this is kind of getting a little out of hand. So, Melinda is to find out that Joel was to be told this story. And so Melinda is telling Vic, it's like, you know what? I don't like that you told him that and you try to scare him off. Like, I'm going to have Joel come over to dinner tonight and you're going to apologize to him. And so they, of course, bring Joel over. And the one thing that they cook for Joel is the one thing that he's actually allergic to. So Vic is like, "Oh, I'm sorry, Joel. I didn't realize that you were allergic." And so they just make him like grilled cheese sandwiches. And so Melinda is going and grabbing one of Joel's grilled sandwiches. And so, mind you, like, Vic and Melinda do have a very young daughter. And so Vic is being forced to read his daughter bedtime stories as both Melinda and Joel are going to just go at it within this house. And so Vic goes on, and he is, of course, to read his daughter a bedtime story, and she falls asleep. And so Vic is kind of going throughout the house, and he's kind of taking this plate and chucking it into the sink, which of course makes this clinking sound. And so Melinda's like, "Oh, hey, honey, you don't have to do the dishes tonight. I'll do that tomorrow." And Vic is like, "Well, I'm wide awake. Like, there's nothing for me to do. But, like, I can't sleep." And so Melinda's like, "Well, just kind of just go upstairs and go on and do something." So Vic is just really upset at this moment, and he's just like, freaking whatever. So what happens is, of course, we find out that Joel is to be leaving to go out of town on business. And so Joel is maybe thinking, like, well, hey, like, maybe in the future, maybe all of us could go on and, like, move in together and, or, like, spend, like, some time together. And Vic is like, well, yeah, if we go to where you're at, we're probably going to go and have a hotel. So Vic, of course, is telling Melinda, it's like, well, I don't really like this Joel character because it doesn't really seem like he has brains. So, really, we just have it after Joel is to leave. Melinda is to move on to another man. Just kind of goes on and just shifts off to another guy. So, Melinda goes and shifts on to meet with a guy named Charles, who's to be this pianist. And so we have it here where Vic is realizing that I guess Melinda is to just blow $3,000 and not even ask her husband about it. And so Vic is like, well, like, can I go on and find the name of which that is on this check? And so, can you give me the name? Because the bank calls and like, hey, like, it seems like this amount is kind of overdrafted, and like, if you want to go on and pay what the fee is. And so Vic agrees to it, but he kind of wants to know the name on the check. So, because the description says piano lessons. And so Vic goes on and he's calling every club around town to go on and see if there's any kind of live band there, and there ends up being one guy who, of course, is this pianist. So Vic goes on to, of course, see who this Charlie character is. And all of a sudden, we have Melinda who's watching on as Charlie is playing here. So we see Vic kind of like say, "Hey, Charlie, you're doing great," like yada yada yada. So now later on, we have yet another party that Vic is to go on to a neighbor's house, and so they have this pool party. Everybody's going to the pool. Everybody's having a good time. Melinda again is throwing her weight around by having Charlie coming to this party, and so at this point, we have a number of people who are kind of getting high and all kinds of things. So, also for this party, we have a guy who we find out is this writer that is to write this story that is to possibly deal with like conspiracies within a town, and so like Don is kind of interested in what exactly that that Vic is to do here, and so he explains. Come to find out, this guy, of course, did have these computer chips for these drones, for I guess a number of people that would go on and possibly kill people, and there's a possible drone piece that he had made that could go on and trace certain people that I guess they would go on to kill. So we have Don who's just like, man, so like you go on and you help these drones like basically kill people. And Vic is like, well, they can also go on and drop off food to a number of people also. And Don is like, well, do the drones just do that also? And Vic is like, well, no. Well, then that's like, you're basically just saying, like, well, like, you're trying to, like, say that what you do, like, doesn't kill people. But technically, Vic is like, well, it's a computer chip. It's not, like, he's not building the drone that kills people, just a part of it. So they go into this party, everyone's getting high as F, and so what ends up happening is it's starting to rain. Everybody starts to get out of the pool, and what happens is Charlie is the last one to leave this pool, and all of a sudden we are seeing that Vic is the second one to leave. Don is kind of peeking his head out, kind of watching as everyone is to leave this pool, and then he makes his way inside. So Vic, of course, is going on into this place trying to scramble for some cookie. He ends up burning his hand as they're kind of quickly trying to make these cookies, because a lot of people are having the munchies because they're freaking high. So all of a sudden, everybody is to start to realize that there's a body in the pool. Charlie is dead. They're like, oh my god, what could have happened? So they pull this guy out of the pool, and it seems like they accidentally drop him. And so Vic is barely trying to do CPR, and Melinda is calling him on it. And so Melinda is saying that Vic is to have killed Charlie, but there's no real hard evidence of that. But Don also has his suspicions also. So police are called, they're filing the report, and everybody's starting to want to separate here. So one of the officers is to separate Vic from everybody and say, like, well, it seems like your wife was having an affair with this Charlie guy. So like, and Vic is like, well, I don't know. Uh, I don't really go in depth and ask my wife a number of things. Like her life is her life. So Vic is to kind of consistently play off what exactly he did. He kind of replayed that he was to, of course, burn his hand with these cookies, and so it seems like they just kind of write off this death as some accident. But we end up finding out that this actually goes on and is to, of course, play out. That Vic actually really did drown Charlie in this pool and murder him. So now that Vic is a murderous man, because we have a yet another moment where another man is to come into fray called Tony. So, and every single time we, of course, have Vic seeing Melinda running off with these men to get half undressed to possibly do something or other, which we barely see. And to where it's like, well, did she have an affair? Is she just trying to consistently, uh, push her husband over the edge? What's really going on here? So, is she a part of this? Is she not a part of this? I don't know. We can write this off any number of ways, but Don also wants to have a private session with this police officer also to kind of put the 2 cents for what he had seen. So we now move on here. And so we of course have Vic and we of course have Melinda that go off with their daughter to some lake, and Vic is to of course show Melinda this book that he made for her because he's a photographer. And so, considering Vic is so rich, he just kind of made this big fat book of all these pictures of Melinda through the ages, and also in the very last page, there was a picture of her being 3 months pregnant, and Melinda's like, "Oh my God, I was 3 months pregnant there." So, while of course Trixie is going through this water, Vic is to realize that Trixie's going through this water and is to try to push her back from the water because it seems that something is protruding through this water. And I'll tell you exactly what this was. So, Vic was to go on and meet with uh, with Tony after going on and finding out that Melinda is to mention to Vic when Vic is to show up at their house that Tony and Melinda had gone on and done it, and Melinda says that Tony was her first ever American that she was to have. And so Tony and her were past lovers and it just didn't work out. And so we consistently have it to where Melinda's kind of touching on Tony and so on and so forth. And so Vic ends up kind of seeing both Tony and Melinda just kind of randomly walking through parts of town. So all of a sudden having Vic realizing that he's being followed for whatever reason, and so Vic confronts Dawn about him possibly hiring some private investigator to follow Vic around, but it seems when finally Vic confronts this private eye, he says that he's a psychotherapist and he's talking to Melinda. And so Vic, of course, is to ask this psychotherapist if he technically has a card, and of course this guy doesn't have any. And so Vic is like, oh, well, that's a little convenient. And so Vic starts asking this guy about psychotherapy, and it really doesn't seem like he has much of any answers. So that's when Vic turns around and confronts Don with his family present and saying, like, hey, like, it seems that Melinda had went on to take a pretty decent number of money out, and it seems like that might be both you and her going halvesies on some private investigator. And Don, of course, is not admitting to that. So really, we have it to where possibly Melinda might have gone on and paid for this guy, or who knows? Maybe Don went on to pay for this guy. But either way, so Vic is to also go on to this party where they were at before Charlie was to be killed, and he is all of a sudden seen dancing with a girl. I believe her name is Kelly, and so we have at one point where we're kind of thinking that maybe Vic is going to finally end up with another woman besides Melinda here, but like we would eventually find out that that would be all wrong. So, but anyways, now back at where we were. So Vic is to go on and meet up with Tony after their first meeting together, and Vic is to tell Tony, hey, like, it seems that Melinda is interested in this one kind of stretch of land, and it seems like this guy is to be a architect of sorts, or a kind of a building guy of some kind. And so Vic is like, well, hey, how about we both go to this location together, and you can kind of give me your expertise about it. So Vic and Tony make their way to this location, and Tony is trying to call Melinda because it's like, well, hey, like, how far is Melinda ahead of us? And Vic is like, well, I'm not sure. So when Tony is to call Melinda, it seems like he isn't getting any bars, and Vic's like, oh, well, that's too bad. So all of a sudden, when Tony is to get out of this car, here's a really cool like spot within this movie, the only real interesting part of this film, really. All of a sudden we have Vic, who chucks this rock and smacks and hits Tony's head, and he's like, whoa, bruh. And so all of a sudden we just have Vic, who's starting to murder Tony with these rocks, and so he goes on and is now burying him basically in this water by just putting a rock on his chest and tying it to him, and hoping that this guy is going to stay under the water. And so now that Melinda and Trixie are both at this location together, the guy is, of course, floating to the surface, and so Vic is trying to get Trixie away from this location so she doesn't notice this dead body. So, as they're leaving, we have Melinda mention that she, of course, is to have left this scarf. And Vic is like, well, hey, like, I'll go on and get that tomorrow morning. I'll definitely go on and get it really quickly. So, Vic is to go back to this location, and all of a sudden, Don is to follow Vic, I guess, to this location, and is realizing that Vic is to be holding some stick, because Vic was to try to press down this body, and all Vic could really find is just this stick, and then all of a sudden Don is to show up. So Vic is mentioning about this scarf to Don, and Don is like, well, hey, like, this scarf was just in the middle of the woods somewhere. Like, why are you in this water? It makes no sense. And Vic is like, well, I was just looking for this scarf. So what ends up happening is Vic has to kind of leave uh, this body off to the side. The body starts popping up, and Dawn starts running off, realizing like, yeah, I knew it that you were this murderer. So Vic goes on and tries to use this bike to chase after Dawn, and Dawn is trying to call people or is to try to leave this text message, and nothing really works. And so Dawn is desperately driving like a madman trying to get the heck out of there. And we all of a sudden have it where both uh, Vic is to meet back up with Dawn, and so Vic is to crash his bike, and Dawn is to swerve out of the way, and Dawn goes off and is to cause an accident, and Vic after that I guess is to kind of wash his hands of all this, and so he goes and walks or bikes his way back home. All the while Melinda is to go on into Vic's snailed uh like pet room. We rarely have Vic who has a number of snails for whatever goofy reason. At one point, we have a number of people that kind of joke around about, like, well, hey, how about we cook the snails? And Vic is like, well, that's the thing about snails. You kind of have to preserve them a certain way. You have to kind of starve them out, and then you can actually eat them because if you try to eat them any other way, you'll get poisoned and then you'll die. So it's like, oh, that's an interesting bit of information. So we then go on and have Melinda who's to find Tony's wallet. And we have a moment where Melinda can go on and have evidence to go against her husband. But what happens when Vic is to come to the house is Melinda just burns the wallet and is to just kind of mention that she saw somebody before. So really Melinda does nothing, and I guess we could probably either say that Melinda like wanted this continuing but Melinda wanted this to continue to happen, or really she was cahoots with Vic this whole time, or really just any number of things at this point could be possible. But with that said, I think that kind of quickly covers most of this film because really there's only just the deaths or just whatever is to kind of fall out of my brain for most of this film because there's really very scarce amount of dialogue. There's very little to really talk about in this film that holds any real true importance besides the possible deaths within this film. We had the one moment, of course, where Trixie was to consistently play Old MacDonald had a farm to where it was driving her mother crazy. Vic was to go on and deliver Trixie to this school, and so all of a sudden Vic is meeting up with some woman that, of course, to go on, I think it's Kristen, and mention to Vic, it's like, well, hey, it seems like you're killing people. And Vic is like, oh, yeah, I heard that's getting around. And so we, of course, have Vic who's going to everybody and just kind of convincing them that he is not the culprit here. He's not the murderer here. But, like, it's kind of interesting how a number of people are all just kind of like, I don't know. So so yeah, like it's also kind of funny when Don is kind of driving crazily to make his way out of there, and he's like justifying, like, yeah, this is definitely going to be a story for my book. Like, my wife didn't think I could create a story. Well, guess what, honey? Yeah. So with that said, that's kind of how most of this movie goes on and plays out. Uh, just kind of a mostly uneventful film. Um, but yeah, it's just however you want to just slice and dice it. It's another affair movie that isn't good enough to garner me to ever rewatch it again. It's just there's maybe a topless scene coming from Melinda, and that's about it. That's all you really get as far as really intriguing parts. At one point, Melinda is to give Vic a blowy, and she consistently bites at Vic. And but you like that's all that really happens because Melinda kind of gets jealous with Vic because Vic had gone on and danced with Kelly, and Melinda gets jealous and is like, "Well, hey, like, you dance with that girl. Like, did you ever think about like effing her?" And Vic is just like, "Well, like, when you go on and kind of play that game with anybody," and so all of a sudden we further have it where Melinda like wants like, do you think that she would f you better than I would? And Vic is like, no, of course not. So like we have like this weird like we have jealousy to like weird absurd degrees, and it's just very odd this film. But with that said, I'm gonna go out of my way to just get out of here. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.